Yes.
All right. Thank you for having me. My name is Brian Youngkin. Like I mentioned before, we are with SKEO Solutions, providing technical support through EPA. This evening's presentation is focusing on the record of decision for Operable Unit 2. This was released in September of this year. Earlier in the summer, there was the proposed plan that was out, identifying several remediation cleanup alternatives, and then the record of decision was just more recently released. I'll just briefly sort of have a couple slides here to bring everyone up to speed on the history leading up to where we are now, but really I want to focus on the record of decision, see where there are some differences from that proposed plan that was released earlier in the summer or the spring or summer, and then you had an opportunity to provide questions or comments. And I just went through the responsiveness summary, which is in that record of decision, just to see how EPA has responded to the community's comments and to see if there's any changes or modifications to the ROD from the original proposed plan. Introductions. Dave Will was with me, I think maybe 3 weeks ago in person when EPA did the presentation. Dave is on another trip right now, so he's unavailable. We do have Joe with us. He'll be sort of in the background, taking notes and just sort of helping out with keeping track of some of the information. And so I will be providing the presentation here. An overview of where we were and how we got to where we are now. We are looking at the Meeker Avenue Plume Superfund site. I believe EPA did identify some other sites. We may be familiar with some other Superfund and environmental sites around the area. But this is looking at 191 acres of a site that spans several city blocks in the Greenpoint and East Williamsburg area of Brooklyn. It's currently 191. Boundaries can change and be modified as studies go along, but it does include approximately 1,000 properties within that site. And the known contaminants of concern are, as Heidi mentioned, some recently banned compounds, the trichloroethylene, the TCE, and the tetrachloroethylene, the PCE, commonly used for cleaning, whether it's like a dry cleaning solution or a degreasing. Very effective at that, but also have some adverse health effects. So those are the two that have been identified as the contaminants of concern for this site. Right now, EPA and the state have identified the exposure pathway of human health concern is the vapor. So those chemicals that may be liquid form in the degreasing or the cleaning process get spilled or leak into the ground, percolate down to the groundwater, sort of sit on top of the groundwater, but then over time, they can volatilize, they evaporate, and those vapors move back up through the soils and into potentially occupied spaces. And that is the concern that we're looking at here. Now we are talking about the cleanup and specifically Operable Unit 2. There are 2 operable units for this site. Operable Unit 2 focuses on the vapor intrusion and the current risk to human health. OU1 is the overall site. It's site-wide, but more specifically, OU1 is and will focus on the source identification. So OU2, what is going to be done, the cleanup process in OU2 is only looking to reduce the risk, reduce the exposure for human health. It is not going to go deeper and remediate, remove the source deeper down or completely identify the source areas. So that is currently being worked and being studied as an Operable Unit 1 action. But for OU2, let's just focus on it is the vapors that are coming back into our buildings that we're concerned about. So going through a quick timeline, as early as 2005, New York State discovered some concerning levels of TCE and PCE, sort of from studying the nearby Greenpoint petroleum spill. And they started to do some more indoor testing through the 2007 through 2022. In March of 2022, New York State sort of turned it over to EPA, where EPA added it to that national priorities list. What that does is it brings it into EPA's CERCLA sort of process on how to identify and clean up the site in a formal way. And it also provides funding to continue the testing and the cleanup process. So that's that super fund. So it is eligible for that. Now, part of it would be the responsible parties would pay for some of that. That is still being figured out through the operable Unit 1 studies. But March 2022, consider is now sort of underneath EPA umbrella, certainly with the state's cooperation and state's assistance here. In March of this year, EPA released a focused feasibility study for OU2. And then in April, EPA released a proposed plan for OU2. So the feasibility study identifies the risk, the exposure routes, and possible alternatives to clean up or reduce that exposure, vapor intrusion in this case. And then in April, with that proposed plan, that identifies the alternatives that sort of rose to the top, what works the best for the site. And then the proposed plan proposes or identifies the preferred plan there. It then is open for a public comment period through the month of April, May, June, I believe it went extended into. Comments are collected, and then in September, EPA released the record of decision, which is the administrative record for OU2, as in this is how we will be proceeded to clean up OU2, the vapors in occupied spaces. Now, OU1 is ongoing. So the remedial investigation, that is what contamination, what are the sources, where is it, is still ongoing. So we're only looking, again, keep coming back to this, we're only looking at the vapor intrusion part of the overall site and not the sources. OU2 is often referred to as the interim remedy. Since it's not addressing the sources and only the indoor air quality, it is sort of like a temporary or an immediate remedy to protect human health. It may be modified, it may be adjusted as more information is uncovered during the OU1 remedial investigation feasibility study process. So it's subject to change, but this is sort of as it stands right now. So OU2 addresses the unacceptable risk in indoor air at residential and non-residential structures resulting from that site-related contamination. Those vapors that are underneath the soils, it didn't leak into the building, it's the vapors that are coming up from underneath and into the building. Like I said before, it does not specify or address the source of contamination. It does enable the EPA to take mitigative measures while the source of contamination are investigated and remedial alternatives are developed. So while we're still trying to, EPA is still trying to figure out the sources and how to treat that deeper contamination, this allows EPA to go in there and protect the humans, remove those vapors. The other goal here or outcome from this OU2 cleanup effort is that it would provide lessons learned to modify the final site-wide remedy that would be eventually offered through OU1 and or supplement, modify, change this interim remedy for OU2. So it's an evolving process that as lessons are learned, can be modified for the site-wide concerns. So the record of decision for Operable Unit 2 I'll read right from here. This is right from the record decision. Vapor intrusion mitigation at residential and non-residential structures where multiple lines of evidence indicate subsurface vapor intrusion is occurring or has the potential to occur at concentrations that represent a threat or potential threat to human health. And so the vapor intrusion mitigation methods include installation of subslab depressurization systems. That's the pipe you see in the picture here, similar to a radon, or basically it's just removing a vacuum, a vapor vacuum that's taking that indoor air or subslab air and pulling it and discharging it outside, exterior to the building. Is one of the methods being used. And then also preventative engineering measures such as sealing of cracks and gaps in the lowest level of a structure, or installing a concrete slab or a membrane if we're talking about a dirt floor or an unfinished bottom level in a building. Basically, a barrier to protect indoor air from vapors from below. On page 24 of the record decision are several changes from the proposed plan. Proposed plan released back in March, opportunity for the community to comment on. Record decision has noted some of these comments and made some changes. One of the most important ones, I think, is I heard about it in the meeting a couple weeks ago, is that residential remedial action levels may be used at any property. And I'll talk about the residential versus commercial remedial action levels, but can be used at any property, residential or non-residential, if there is any reason to believe the commercial industrial remedial action limits are not sufficiently conservative. So if there's concerns about duration of work hours or living accommodations in a commercial industrial property, residential remedial actions can be used at those commercial properties. EPA will determine whether to apply those residential action limits or on commercial or industrial sites on a case-by-case basis in consultation with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Health. And then another aspect or change from the proposed plan is that if other contaminants of concern are identified during this indoor air sampling, then that can be added or reviewed for the overall OU1 study. So the contaminants of concern, PCE and TCE, is not locked in. If there are other contaminants of concern that are identified, they can be added to the list and be addressed appropriately. So getting back to that residential versus commercial industrial remedial action limits. This was provided in the ROD, and I believe EPA had this on their presentation a couple weeks ago. Your TCE, your PCE, your contaminants, residential limits versus commercial limits, indoor air versus subslab air. Subslab is generally not something that we have direct contact with. And that is, as my one bullet point indicates, EPA's guidance is to consider that the subslab remedial action levels is 33 times what you would get from an indoor air sample. So that's where those numbers come from. Now, several of those numbers, specifically the TCE at 2.1 micrograms per cubic meter for indoor air for residential, is slightly higher than the state. I believe state is 2.0. EPA's 2.1, it does have, it is in line with the screening levels that EPA provides, and that provides a hazard quotient of 1, and it falls right in the middle of that cancer risk management range of between 1 in a million and 1 in 10,000. So it falls right in there. And I have seen in other sites that the EPA and states can vary a little bit on the remedial action levels. So I know that the committee has noted that. I don't think that's out of line, but it is different, as you guys have pointed out. Residential action levels are generally much lower than commercial, industrial, and a lot of that has to do with your exposure. Think time, duration, frequency. Resident, they sort of anticipate that that person would be exposed to those levels 24 hours a day, whether they're working from home or possibly working in one of those commercial facilities, but then coming back home and just thinking that they could be exposed for up to 24 hours a day. Duration, how many years they may be in that location, and frequency, how often you are home versus how often you're at work. So as you can see, time, duration, frequency are generally all greater for residents versus commercial industrial. And generally, you're going to be looking at the most vulnerable population, which for residents could be a child. For a commercial industrial setting, a work setting, that would be for elderly or pregnant individual for the most vulnerable populations. Now, obviously, that can change if there is long-term occupation, or not occupation, but living accommodations within these commercial industrial settings. So we'll get to that in a minute. But there was some concern raised that many of us work longer than the 8 hours per day. And certainly we can do some math. Okay, 10 hours, your concentrations should be lower because you're exposed for longer, or 12 hours. It's just a basic ratio so that in the end, the overall, say within a week, month, a year, your overall exposure should be similar, whether you're doing that in 8-hour increments or 10-hour increments. So, but that is looking at how those exposure rates can be modified for different durations. But backing up now, I highlighted this earlier, multiple lines of evidence. And so in the record of decision, the ROD, EPA states that subsurface vapor intrusion mitigation would be implemented at structures where EPA determines that based on multiple lines of evidence, vapor intrusion of the COCs is occurring or has the potential to occur at concentrations that exceed those remedial action levels, which means that whether it is residential limits that are being tested to or commercial limits that are being tested to, that is just one avenue or one line of evidence. So even if those action levels would be maybe slightly below those action limits, if there are other lines of evidence that indicate, hey, we may have a problem here, there may be some intrusion, there may be vapors here, we may not be capturing it with our sampling, but there's other evidence. And that could be, maybe there's an at-risk population, a preschool or a school, elderly, or subsurface geology or hydrogeology. As OU1, as those drill rigs are out in the street taking samples deeper down in the groundwater or soil samples, and they identify geology or hydrogeology that would indicate higher concentrations deeper down that could rise up to those buildings. Those elevated contamination levels that could rise up to those buildings, or certain buildings that may have structural characteristics that would promote or increase the chance of those vapors coming into the building, or nearby structures. Those are all lines of evidence. So the indoor sampling is not, I don't think, EPA's sole identifier. It's sort of looking at everything here. So I do like the idea of the multiple lines of evidence, so you're not just relying on one piece. But I hope that EPA would identify that even if, okay, we haven't exceeded those action limits through indoor air sampling, that these other lines of evidence do indicate that we may have a problem here. Let's go ahead and do some type of mitigation. That is sort of the direction I would like to see EPA go, and the community could certainly voice that or mention that in discussions. This is a question that I had earlier looking at the proposed plan, and it sounds like they're doing some sampling now. They're slowly ticking off the properties. But if I'm looking at this, around 1,000 properties or parcels that need to have that should have air sampling conducted. I think 210 or so of those parcels, now 6 more as of last week or going into this week, we're at about 21% completion. And that is from years of sampling from the New York State and then the last couple of years through EPA. So I know that I think on page 15 of the ROD, EPA would like to have this done in sort of a 5-year plan. I don't see that they're on path to do this in 5 years. So that would be, they know this in the responsiveness summary. And EPA's response, I think this may have been one of the early questions, may have been question number 2, comment question number 2 in the responsiveness summary. But EPA's response is that they plan to update the site's community involvement plan, and they want to explore more ideas to increase community participation. I like that there are a number of us on this call that are doing outreach and part of the community outreach, trying to get the word out. But I think EPA really needs to rely on you, or needs to at least, the community and EPA need to work together to try to sort of kick this a little bit faster, move it along a little bit more, because 5 years is pretty optimistic at the current pace I'm looking at here. So that is one of the sort of the unresolved comments, questions that I see coming out of this ROD. Now we look at the cluster map here. We understand that EPA can't put individual dots all over the map here on places they've identified, privacy considerations, things like that. So it's been condensed into a cluster map. So looking at 9 different groupings and giving sort of a span to protect privacy on roughly how many parcels, properties are in that cluster, how many have been sampled, and then how many mitigation systems or mitigations, whether it's extraction or sealing of the basement, has been conducted within those clusters. Let's highlight some of those. Clusters 4, 6, and 7. So the blue, the red, the brown. I've sort of outlined it in green there. How many of those have been tested? 17, 24, 13. So maybe on average, 20% of those. Actually, it looks like I've skewed that a little. My lines are off a little bit there, but what I'm trying to highlight here is actually the blue, the red, and the brown. So I'm sorry, shift those yellow lines down slightly, those highlighted lines down a little bit. What I want to highlight here is the percentage that have been mitigated, that required mitigation. And so in cluster group 5, the light blue, 20% of those properties have been mitigated or required mitigation. 38% of the red group have required mitigation, and 43% of the brown group have required mitigation. And that's just of the properties that have been sampled. And only 20 to 30% of those properties have been sampled. So I'm just looking from an overall picture. Yes, we want to see all the properties sampled for indoor air quality. However, there may be some incentive to sort of put some emphasis on those areas, because I see there's a greater need, or at least a greater chance that those we're missing mitigation potential here in those properties that seem to have some higher levels of occurrences. And that may correlate to some of the OU1 studies where they're doing the deeper drilling in the street and things like that. Maybe they're identifying a higher concentration underneath those facilities. Again, that multiple line of evidence. Is there some more contamination in the groundwater beneath that area? So just something to think about. I also, when I look at a site, and I'm always reminded that a a Superfund site, the boundaries, it's not preset. These are preliminary boundaries. They can expand or contract depending on where the contamination is identified. Seeing that I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but where the green highlight is there, it goes right to the edge, looking to the south here. It goes right to the edge of the site boundaries. I think it'd be good to check out what's farther south of, let's not put our blinders on and stop at the pre-established site boundaries, but let's look farther south and make sure that we've got a hot spot just north of there. Make sure that we're not missing anything to the south of there. I do see that some of the area to the southeast, ball fields and open space there, fewer buildings, so probably less indoor air concerns there. But still, I'd like to see, okay, identify the hot spots, but then certainly extend it out far enough that so we know the true limits of where that contamination may be. So that sort of talks about some potential sampling focus areas. EPA notes in the ROD that each building is constructed differently and its similarities between adjacent buildings should not be assumed. Now, in one of their multiple lines of evidence examples is sort of looking at hotspots and identifying other buildings around that. So yes, each building down the street may be different, but if you're starting to see, like I mentioned the cluster map earlier, just in the previous slide, if we're starting to see some areas that have some higher occurrence of needed mitigation, maybe focus on more sampling those areas. Sampling season. Right now, the sampling season is ongoing or the EPA is doing some sampling right now, and that is really, you're going to get the highest concentrations of these vapors when all your doors, all your windows are closed up, and you've got heat, you're heating the building, the heat rises through the building, whereas that promotes air from coming in through the bottom and not being flushed out with doors and windows being open, fresh air coming in. So the best time to get that highest level of contamination is during that indoor heating season. That's when the sampling is taking place. I believe EPA is sampling right now, and they've also planned on sampling again in February, March. Anytime during the winter would be a good time to sample. Also, I heard in the presentation 3 weeks ago that in the sampling process, EPA likes to sample in 3 locations: below the floor slab, the lowest floor in the building, in the basement, the lowest in the indoor air in the lowest part of the building, and that first floor. So get all 3 of those. So when we think about how a building is used, that may be multiple tenants or even multiple owners for one building footprint. So it takes some coordination to make sure that those sampling devices can get into all the areas needed to get a complete indoor sample for those different places. Additional contaminants of concern. Again, I talked about the TCE, PC have been identified as the primary contaminants of concern here. OU1 is addressing the larger area and potentially adding to that. Currently, there are 6 potential sources that have been identified, and those would be several dry cleaners, some historic metal fabricators, or I think a steel drum cleaning facility. So those are, and more sources, responsible parties may be identified, and the actual involvement of those companies would be determined in the OU1 process and sort of outside of this vapor intrusion mitigation aspect here. So in conclusion, I highlight several suggested community action items to sort of keep the process moving along. I know we've moved beyond the public comment period to get this ROD into action, but still the community is certainly involved in the process. And number 1 would be to assist or work with EPA in getting the word out, informing the public, promoting the indoor air sampling, moving that process along. 6 in 1 week, that's great. Let's I mean, try to get more throughout the winter season and get the word out there. Get residents involved. Get pressure on landlords if needed, and also identify multiple indoor air sampling locations within a building. Also, this is getting back to the timeline. The community, I recommend just continually requesting progress updates from the EPA. How many did you sample this week? How many you can sample next week? How many are you scheduled to sample? Boom, boom, boom. Just keep that pressure on them and keep reminding them 5 years and counting and see where that timeline's taking them. So they'll probably push back and ask for some help in getting the word out, but that's going to be back and forth just to try to get that sampling moving along. And then the third bullet point I have here is EPA will address and consider the remedial action limits for residential versus commercial on a case-by-case basis. And this is where the community can step up and identify commercial locations, commercial industrial locations that may have some residential component or long working hours or extended exposure for the occupants of that building, and help EPA put those lower limits, the residential limits, on what would otherwise be just labeled a commercial industrial property, maybe on a zoning map. So keep that information flowing for EPA to make those informed decisions. And that's what I have. I didn't keep track of my time, but I hope I didn't run over my 30 minutes too much. And I do open it up to questions now.